American Top 40.
This is Casey Kasem in Hollywood. We're ready now for the best-selling song in the USA. It's the biggest hit ever by the pioneer of rock and roll, who had really wanted to become a hairdresser. He was born and raised in St. Louis, and while he was going to Sumner High School, he bought a used 6-string Spanish guitar and a set of instruction books, all for $4. By 1952, he had his own group, and for the next few years, he played and sang on weekends at local clubs. But all this time, what he was really wanting to do was become a full-time hairdresser. And that's just what he might be doing today if he hadn't met blues singer Muddy Waters during a vacation in 1955. Muddy suggested to the young singer, songwriter, and guitarist that he forget about the hairdressing business and go see a guy at Chess Records who just might take an interest in him. Well, that visit resulted in a contract and this artist's first record, the rock and roll classic of 1955. Maybelline. And that's how the man who wanted to become a hairdresser became instead one of the fathers of rock and roll. His latest hit, and the biggest hit of his career, is number 1 again this week. My Ding-a-Ling by the frustrated hairdresser, Chuck Berry.
We got to do our alma mater. We must do our alma mater. Ding-a-ling.
At number 1 for the second consecutive week. That's Chuck Berry on American Top 40 with My Ding-a-Ling.
American Top 40.
Well, it's time now for the hit song written by the man who's been described as the single most important name in the history of rock and roll. He began writing and singing his songs back in the mid-50s, and during the next decade, he produced a string of hits whose words and music have been more influential than the works of any other rock artist or group, with the exception of the Beatles. In her famous Rock Encyclopedia, pop music critic Lillian Roxon described him this way: "There's not a rock musician working today who has not consciously or unconsciously borrowed from his sound." End of quote. And another rock historian, Charlie Gillette, summarized the music of this rock giant with these words: "If it's to be measured in terms of imaginativeness, creativeness, wit, the ability to translate a variety of experiences and feelings into musical form, and in long-term reputation, Chuck Berry would have to be described as the major figure of rock and roll." End of quote. Well, there probably isn't a music critic around who at one time or another hasn't referred to Chuck Berry as Mr. Rock and Roll. Here are the Beach Boys with an all-time Chuck Berry classic.
Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music. You wanna dance with me?
The Beach Boys with a song produced by Brian Wilson and written by Chuck Berry, Rock and Roll Music.
American Top 40.
Well, now, whatever happened to the man who told Beethoven to roll over, told Johnny to be good, and taught us all to do the duck walk? Whatever happened to Chuck Berry, one of the cornerstones of rock and roll? You know, Chuck Berry first came on the music scene in the mid-50s when rock was just beginning to roll. His main booster was disc jockey Alan Freed, and Berry became one of the first truly legendary performers with songs like Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, Johnny Be Good, and Sweet Little 16. Like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry was a symbol of youthful rebellion. Unfortunately, at the height of his career, Chuck was sentenced to 2 years in jail for violating the Mann Act. When he got out in the early 60s, rock music had changed, and it took him a long time to regain his momentum. For the past few years, Berry's been a star of rock and roll revival shows. Until recently, that is, when his career hit another legal snag. You may have read about it. Just a few weeks ago, he was convicted of income tax evasion and was sentenced to serve 4 months in prison and to contribute 1,000 hours to community service projects, including a series of benefit concerts to discourage young people from using drugs. "I'm sorry," said Chuck Berry after his conviction. "It shall not happen again." And that's whatever happened to Chuck Berry. And the countdown continues.
Number 38.
Later that same year, America was introduced to one of the true pioneers of rock and roll, Charles Edward Anderson Berry. Chuck Berry's distinctive guitar playing was a model for generations of rockers to come, and his trademark duck walk was a lesson in stage performance. He wrote many of his own songs, and his clever lyrics had a sly sense of humor. Songs like Sweet Little 16, Johnny Be Good, and Roll Over Beethoven. Now, here's Chuck Berry with a song recorded May 21st, 1955. Maybelline. From the
the summer of 1955, Chuck Berry with Maybelline. I'm Casey Kasem with our Millennium Special, the 40 Days That Changed Music.
Counting down the hits with Casey Kasem.